fog-shrouded streets, a distant clock strikes midnight. This was Whitechapel in 1888, where more than 80,000 people crowded each square mile, and life expectancy for the poor fell below 45. Then the killings began. 5 women brutally murdered, each more shocking than the last, while panic spread through a divided city. 135 years later, no one can say for certain who Jack the Ripper really was. But what turned these desperate streets into a hunting ground? And why did the world's most infamous serial killer vanish without a trace? This is Jack the Ripper, the unsolved terror of London, and the true horror was just beginning. Whitechapel in 1888 was a maze of narrow lanes and crumbling tenements, where more than 80,000 people squeezed into each square mile. Rows of cheap lodging houses lined the streets, offering a hard mattress for a few pennies a night. For many, the choice was simple: share a bed with strangers or sleep outside in the filth and cold. The air reeked of refuse, smoke, and sweat. Day and night, the streets never emptied. Labourers, hawkers, and women with nowhere else to go drifted through the fog, searching for food, work, or shelter. In these packed quarters, privacy was a luxury only the rich could afford. Families of 6 or more crowded into a single room, while the poorest rented a space on the floor by the hour. The constant press of bodies, the noise, and the hunger bred tension and desperation. In a city divided by wealth, Whitechapel's endless crowds became both a shield and a trap, offering anonymity for a killer and no safe corner for the vulnerable. After sundown, Whitechapel's streets turned treacherous for women. Most had few choices for honest work. Laundry, scrubbing floors, or selling trinkets barely kept hunger away. Many, especially those without husbands or family, turned to the streets to survive. Prostitution offered a handful of coins, but it meant walking alone through alleys where the gas lamps barely flickered and shadows swallowed every corner. Police patrols were thin, and the law did little to protect women labelled as unfortunates. Even a warm bed in a common lodging house required payment each night. Missing a day's earnings meant sleeping outside, exposed to the cold and to strangers. The average woman in Whitechapel was unlikely to see her 45th birthday. Disease, violence, and poverty claimed lives early, but the threat of a faceless predator brought a new kind of terror. In this world, every darkened doorway and every footstep behind could signal danger. For women scraping by at the edge of survival, the streets were both workplace and hunting ground, places where the smallest misstep could be fatal. On the final morning of August 1888, a cart rattled down Bucks Row, its wheels striking cobblestones slick with rain. At 3:40 a.m., Charles Cross, a local carman, stumbled upon the body of Mary Ann Nichols. She was 43, a laundress and mother, turned out onto the streets after a failed marriage and a string of lost jobs. Nichols had spent the night drifting between lodging houses, searching for enough coins to buy a bed. Witnesses saw her last less than an hour before, weaving through Whitechapel's maze of alleys. Her throat had been cut so deeply the wound reached her spine. Her abdomen was slashed open, intestines exposed to the morning chill. Police and the coroner, Dr. Llewellyn, noted the violence was far beyond what was needed to kill. Nichols's pockets held a comb, a handkerchief, and a broken piece of mirror, small reminders of a life spent scraping by. News spread quickly, panic rising among women who recognized her face from the lodging houses. The city's undercurrent of fear began to swell. A little over a week later, before dawn on September 8th, the killer struck again. Annie Chapman, age 47, was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Chapman's story echoed Nichols's. Once married, once stable, now adrift. She lived hand to mouth, pawning her few belongings for drink or a night's shelter. Neighbours heard her arguing with a man in the early hours. By 6 a.m, John Davis, a resident, discovered her body lying against the fence. Her throat was severed, her abdomen laid open, and her uterus removed and placed beside her. Dr. Phillips, the attending coroner, remarked on the speed and precision of the mutilations, suggesting knowledge of anatomy. Witnesses recalled seeing Chapman alive just before 5:30, speaking with a man described as dark-haired and foreign-looking. The police found no murder weapon, no clear trail. Both murders sent shockwaves through Whitechapel. The brutality, the choice of victims, and the killer's vanishing act left residents terrified to walk the streets after dark. For women like Nichols and Chapman, survival meant risk. Each night a gamble between hunger and harm. Their deaths were not isolated tragedies, but warnings. In the shadows, someone was watching, waiting for the next woman forced to choose between shelter and safety. The sense of dread grew heavier with each sunrise, as the city braced for what might come next. Just after midnight on September 30th, 1888, a pony cart clattered into Dutfield's yard off Berner Street. Louis Demschutz, the steward of the Workers' Club, pulled up short. His horse refused to move. On the ground lay Elizabeth Stride, her throat cut from ear to ear, blood still pooling beneath her. She was 44, Swedish-born and known to scrape by on odd jobs and street work. Demschutz ran for help, blowing his whistle. Within minutes, police and club members crowded the yard, but the killer had already vanished into the night. Stride's body showed only the single deep wound, no mutilations. Investigators and doctors concluded the murderer was interrupted. Someone or something had spooked him before he could finish. While police swarmed Berner Street, another woman was released from a nearby police station. Catherine Eddowes, 46, had spent the evening in a cell for drunkenness. At 1:38 a.m, she stepped into the fog heading toward Mitre Square. Less than 15 minutes later, Constable Edward Watkins, making his rounds, found her body sprawled in the shadows. Eddowes' throat was slashed, her face was cut in a frenzy, nose, eyelids and cheeks sliced open. Her abdomen was ripped wide with her left kidney and womb removed. The mutilation was precise and swift. Medical testimony estimated the killer took no more than 5 or 6 minutes before melting back into the darkness. The two murders, separated by less than an hour and less than a mile, sent a wave of panic through the city. Newspapers dubbed it the double event. The police found a piece of Eddowes' blood-stained apron discarded in a doorway on Golston Street, linking the scenes. Above it, a chalk message on the wall warned that the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. Officers argued over whether to erase the writing, worried it might spark anti-Semitic riots. The evidence was wiped away before dawn, leaving only confusion and rumour. 6 weeks later, the violence reached its peak. On November 9th, Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the five, was found dead inside her small room at 13 Miller's Court. She was just 25. That morning, her landlord's assistant, Thomas Bowyer, came to collect overdue rent. Receiving no answer, he peered through a broken window and recoiled. Kelly's body was barely recognizable. Her throat cut to the bone, her face destroyed, her organs removed and scattered around the room. Dr. Phillips, the police surgeon, described the mutilations as the most extensive he had ever seen. Unlike the others, Kelly had been killed indoors, giving the murderer time and privacy. The walls and bed were splashed with blood. Clothing and bedding had been burned in the fireplace, possibly for light or to destroy evidence. With Kelly's murder, the killer's brutality reached its most horrifying form. The city, already gripped by fear, now faced the reality that even locked doors offered no protection. The Ripper had moved from the streets into the very heart of his victim's home. The murders stopped as suddenly as they had begun, but the terror and unanswered questions remained, echoing through every alley and lodging house in Whitechapel. Late September 1888, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency. The writer claimed to be the killer, signing off with a name that would haunt headlines for decades: Jack the Ripper. The Dear Boss letter, as it became known, taunted police and described the murders with chilling detail. Editors delayed handing it over, eager to break the story first. When newspapers published the letter, the city's fear turned to frenzy. Crowds gathered at newsstands, desperate for updates. The press, hungry for readers, splashed the Ripper's new name across their front pages. Panic spread even faster than the killer's shadow. Days later, a postcard arrived. "Saucy Jackie," it began, boasting about the double event, the murders of Stride and Eddowes, and promising more bloodshed. The timing and details convinced some the writer had inside knowledge, but not everyone was certain. Even as the letters stoked terror, police and journalists debated whether the author was the murderer or a cruel prankster. Some suspected reporters themselves, eager to keep the story alive. Then, in October, George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee received a grim package: half a human kidney, accompanied by a note known as the From Hell letter. The handwriting was crude, the message short. Doctors couldn't confirm if the organ came from a victim. The authenticity of all these letters remains hotly debated, but their effect was undeniable. Each word fanned the flames of fear, turning a city's anxiety into full-blown hysteria and piling pressure onto police already outmatched by a faceless killer. Detectives in 1888 faced a maze of dead ends, not just from the killer's cunning, but from their own tools and turf wars. There was no fingerprinting, no blood analysis, no way to match a boot print or a hair to a name. At every murder scene, officers relied on lantern light, measuring tapes, and memory. Crowds pressed in, trampling footprints and snatching souvenirs before the police could secure the evidence. Bodies were moved, clues handled, or lost. Even the best medical examiners could only guess at the time of death by the warmth of a body or the food left in a victim's stomach. Two police forces split the city. The Metropolitan Police patrolled most of Whitechapel, but the old Roman walls marked a hard boundary. Cross into the city, and the City of London Police took charge. This mattered most after the murder of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. Her body lay just inside city lines, while the rest of the murders fell to the Metropolitan Force. Each agency kept its own files, questioned witnesses separately, and sometimes refused to share leads. When Eddowes' blood-stained apron was found on Goulston Street, arguments broke out over who should investigate. Officers duplicated interviews, missed connections, and let precious hours slip away. Senior men like Chief Inspector Swanson and Superintendent McWilliam met to compare notes, but the reality was rivalry, not partnership. Local residents, frustrated by official failures, formed their own patrols, the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, hoping to catch the killer themselves. But without scientific methods or a united front, the search for Jack the Ripper was hampered at every turn. The gaps in technology and teamwork left the murderer free to disappear into the fog, his identity shielded by confusion as much as cunning. Aaron Kosminski's name appears again and again in the surviving police files. A Polish immigrant barber, he lived in the heart of Whitechapel, just streets from the murder scenes. By 1891, he was committed to an asylum, described as violent, delusional, and tormented by voices. Scotland Yard's secret memoranda, unearthed decades later, quietly labelled him a prime suspect, though he was never charged. In recent years, a stained shawl said to be found at the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder was tested for DNA. Scientists announced a match between mitochondrial DNA on the cloth and Kosminski's living relatives. But the evidence is tangled in controversy. The shawl's true origin is disputed, and the same DNA markers could belong to thousands. Even among experts, the debate remains unsettled. Montague John Druitt's story is another that refuses to fade. A well-educated barrister and schoolteacher, Druitt vanished just weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. His body surfaced in the Thames in December 1888, an apparent suicide. Some detectives, desperate for closure, speculated that the killing stopped because the murderer was dead. Yet no witness ever placed Druitt near Whitechapel, and his own family suspected only a mental breakdown. Then there is the royal conspiracy theory. Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, whispered about in books and films for decades. The timeline doesn't fit. Court records and travel logs show the prince was far from London during several of the murders. Still, the idea of a killer hidden behind palace walls continues to grip the imagination. Others point to butchers, doctors, or nameless madmen, arguing that the cuts showed anatomical skill or that the killer melted back into the crowds after each attack. Each theory offers a new suspect, a new puzzle piece, but none have closed the case. The Ripper's identity remains a blank space, inviting speculation, doubt, and the hope that one day a single name will finally be proven. Jack the Ripper's crimes did more than terrify a city. They forced a reckoning with how police investigated violent crime. In 1888, officers relied on memory, witness statements, and the faint hope that someone would recognize a face in the crowd. Physical evidence, bloody footprints, scraps of clothing, often vanished before it could be studied. There was no way to link a killer to a crime scene unless he was caught red-handed. The frustration and public outcry that followed the Ripper murders drove home the need for better tools. By 1901, Scotland Yard opened Britain's first fingerprint bureau, introducing a system that could identify repeat offenders with certainty. The first conviction based on fingerprints came the next year when Harry Jackson was sent to prison for burglary. If such methods had been available in Whitechapel, the outcome might have been different. Yet the Ripper's legacy stretches far beyond police files. His shadow lingers in popular culture, fueling a fascination that has never faded. The unsolved nature of the case gave birth to a field all its own, Ripperology, where amateur sleuths and historians pore over old evidence, hoping to find the missing piece. Walking tours weave through the East End, retracing the killer's steps for tourists from around the world. Books, films, and documentaries keep the story alive, blending fact with legend. The Ripper became more than a murderer. He became a symbol of the unknown, a reminder of the limits of justice and the enduring power of a mystery that refuses to be solved. In 1888, Whitechapel was home to over 80,000 people per square mile, with women facing a life expectancy under 45. 5 murders in just 12 weeks, documented in police reports and coroner's inquests, sent shockwaves through London and the world. Despite hundreds of statements, official memoranda, and the introduction of fingerprinting in British policing by 1901, the Ripper's identity remains unproven. Suspects like Kosminski and Montague Druitt were investigated but never charged, and the authenticity of infamous letters, including "From Hell," is still debated. No physical evidence has ever confirmed a single suspect. The case exposed gaps in Victorian policing and drove reforms that shaped modern forensics. Today, the murders are still unsolved. Many police files remain lost or incomplete. Yet over a century later, historians and the public continue to study the records drawn by the unanswered question, who was Jack the Ripper? The facts are clear. The mystery endures.